Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. My colleagues at The Grayzone, Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton, were recently in Nicaragua for the 40th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution.
We're here at Managua's Plaza Central, where you can see behind me hundreds of thousands of people gathered to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Sandinista Front's victory over the dictator Anastasio Somoza in 1979 and the victory of the Sandinista Party and the elected government over a US-backed coup last year.
Joining me still is Max Blumenthal. He is a senior editor at The Grayzone, author of The Management of Savagery. Welcome, Max. You went back to Nicaragua recently. You were there a year ago covering the US-backed coup. Talk to us about what you saw.
Well, when I arrived a year ago in Nicaragua, it was actually on a day before the anniversary that is observed every year in the central plaza in Managua, Plaza de la Fe, where Sandinistas from around the country come out and celebrate the July 19th anniversary of the overthrow of the US-backed dictator Anastasio Somoza. Last year was an interesting, pretty remarkable event because many Sandinistas beforehand were not even sure anyone would show up. People from outside Managua were unable to come because of the fear that their caravans of buses would be attacked by the opposition. They had just overcome a violent coup in which many Sandinistas were killed, were tortured, were kidnapped. Their businesses and homes had been burned, completely ignored by U.S. media. And what I saw last year was what you could call a small turnout because it was Managua only, but pretty much anyone who supported the Sandinista Front in the Managua area showed up, and it was the celebration of the defeat of a U.S.-backed coup. This year, there might have been 500,000 people, which is a substantial portion of Nicaragua's population in that square. It was absolutely massive. And so I remember last year being able to walk around in the plaza and talk to different people. There was absolutely no space to move this year. It was just, I've never seen anything larger than that, that I can remember in recent memory, and really puts the lie to this idea that Daniel Ortega is a dictator who has no popular base, who's oppressing his own people. He may have a much larger and more enthusiastic base than Donald Trump or any Democratic candidate that I can think of. It was just really unbelievable. And when I was there, I actually got to meet a number of iconic figures who participated in the Sandinista Revolution. The widow of Thomas Borges, who was one of the founders of the Sandinista Front and helped create the Nicaraguan police force. Carlos Fonseca Jr., whose father, Carlos Fonseca, was another founder of the Sandinista Front and who was murdered by Somoza's men a few years before the '79 revolution. I met Comandante Cerro, Eden Pastora, who was one of the leading, I guess you could call him general or commander during the armed struggle that the Sandinista Front waged in the '70s, and he switched sides to the Contras and is now back in the Sandinista fray. And so it really shows that a lot of the key figures are still with the Sandinistas, even though you hear about all of these Sandinista figures who've turned against Ortega, and they get a lot of airtime and they get a big platform in Western intelligentsia to complain about the government. But for the most part, the icons of the revolution, those who are living or those who bear their legacy, have stuck with the revolution. And Eden Pastora, remains a critic of the government, but he said that while it might be, legless and with one eye, it's a revolution nonetheless. So meeting the people at the top was remarkable, but then going out into the streets after the celebration and talking to grassroots Sandinistas, especially young people, the Sandinista youth, I thought was something that everyone who's watching the U.S. election closely, the Democratic primary, particularly people who support Bernie Sanders because he wants to implement free college. He wants to wipe out student debt because he wants to provide universal health care and Medicare for all. They should know that Nicaragua, because of the Sandinistas, in the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, has all of these things for the most part. And this is something that young people emphasize to me. They, and their political education is just at an extremely high level. We can go to a clip of maybe one of the interviews here.
Bueno, este gobierno nos ha dado a los jóvenes más que todo la gracia y el derecho de restituir cada uno en la educación, también en el ámbito de la salud, en el ámbito también del sector educativo. ¡Bien, comandante!
Esta nueva etapa de la revolución nos ha enseñado que tenemos un líder que se preocupa por los pobres. Por eso hoy la juventud no vivimos en 1979, pero estamos viviendo esta etapa desde el 2007 hasta la fecha, donde se le ha entregado salud gratuita, educación gratuita, plan techo a cada una de las familias y a los más desprotegidos familias nicaragüenses.
What you heard there is a young person explaining why they want to fight to defend their government and their revolution as part of the movement behind that government. And it's because they now have a future, to have an education and to have health care. Actually, while I was there, I had to get stitches for an injury and I got to experience the healthcare system and I didn't have to pay a cent. I went to a first class emergency room that hadn't been there during the sort of technocratic neoliberal US, pro-US government that preceded Ortega. And there was a pharmacy in the emergency room. There was first-class equipment. There were doctors who were Nicaraguan but had been trained in Cuba. And I'd never had a better experience at a hospital in my life. I was stunned when they said, everything's free here. What are you asking to pay for? So this is actually democratic socialism in action. And it's there are many Americans who went in the 1980s to help the Sandinistas defend their revolution. But I feel like the support on the left is waning because of a disinformation campaign. I would just encourage people to go to Nicaragua and see what I saw, or at least to listen to the people in this video, especially the young people, explain why they were out in the plaza.
Well, part of the problem, as you pointed out, is we've been presented with such a distorted picture here in the West. I mean, thinking back to a year ago, what we heard in the media was that there was a people's uprising against this tyrant Ortega, and that is how the corporate media in the U.S. and even some progressive media as well presented it to us. You went there though, Max, and it was interesting to compare your reporting to what we saw, because you went into places, you went into schools that had been taken over by protesters. You painted such a different picture from what we were used to seeing a year ago when this was going on.
Yeah, I think I was the first reporter who got into Anon, which is a public university, a free public university that serves students from all over Nicaragua, and was, part of the legacy of Carlos Fonseca, who had this idea to defer 6% from the defense budget into education. This school had been ransacked after it was taken over by opposition students, most of whom came from outside, and many of whom were not even students. Many were just common criminals. And I, was shocked by what I saw on campus. A preschool, a daycare center, which provided free daycare for the children of the staff, was torched, was burned to the ground by these violent elements who basically used it to bivouac as they waged attacks on, police outside. Then there was a community healthcare center, it was basically a reproductive healthcare center and gynecological clinic that served the community, again, with free healthcare, completely ransacked because the quote unquote students who were celebrated in US media, most of whom went to a private, more upscale university called the University of Central America, where the regime change arm of the US government, the National Endowment for Democracy, carries out its training programs. They ransacked the place. It was just absolutely destroyed. And it really showed the kind of entitlement of these students. I was on campus, escorted onto campus by leaders of the student union, and they emphasized to me that what they had witnessed there was a class war. So really what I saw in the plaza with the celebration of the 40th anniversary of the defeat of Somoza was also kind of a consolidation of the victory of not just the government, but the people who'd benefited from its policies over this kind of terror. And what they emphasized is that, seeing 500,000 people there, it means we're not going to go back to a dictatorship where we have to live in fear and we have to have everything taken away from us again. But they experienced that fear through large parts of the country last year. And there's no way that U.S. corporate media is going to tell this story. So I'm currently working on a documentary. I took a lot of footage with our colleague Thomas Hedges. And, we're going to have it out by the end of the year to show the other side of the story. I also spoke to Daniel Ortega last year, and we, along with Ben Norton, had a second interview with him and his wife, Rosario Murillo, who is the vice president of Nicaragua and oversees the day-to-day communication strategy of the government, yet at the same time is rarely ever interviewed in English media. So I thought that was a really interesting exchange. And their mood was dramatically different than last year when Ortega kind of emerged out of nowhere. He hadn't given interviews to foreign press for 11 years, and he started making the rounds. And I think I was the second or third interview he had. So, it was a much more casual setting. They were much more confident. They had a meeting the day before with Javad Zarif of Iran, who's also faced a U.S. economic attack. And what Ortega emphasized is, and it's a language that I hadn't heard him speak before, is the desire for a multipolar world, to find other allies besides the U.S. To protect his country, to insulate his country from the impact of new sanctions, which have been levied in the form of the NICA Act. And, just since we just had a conversation about Venezuela, there's an interesting contrast between Nicaragua and Venezuela, which is that Nicaragua has almost total food sovereignty. It produces most of its food locally, whereas Venezuela, because its economy has been structured around the oil industry, doesn't have the same kind of rural food production base. So Nicaraguans that I spoke to were much more confident about their ability to resist the impact of sanctions. At the same time, Ortega's made many more concessions than Maduro has. He's been able to, but many of the people who participated in violence during last year's coup attempt have been let out under pressure from the Organization of American States and the U.S. And that's part of that's the other side of Ortega's government attempting to get out from under U.S. sanctions.
So Max, finally, I want to ask you about the contrast between the congressional oversight of what the Trump administration is doing in Latin America today, in places like Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba, and contrast that to what was happening in the 1980s. You mentioned that there was the NICA Act imposing these sanctions on Nicaragua, passed pretty recently, and as I understand it, it was passed with overwhelming, if not unanimous, support in Congress. Imposing these sanctions on Nicaragua. Now, comparing that to the 1980s, obviously there was some support from the Democrats for the Reagan administration's terror war in Nicaragua, but there was some pushback too. There was some efforts to cut off funding for the Contra war after it got out of hand. And I'm wondering if you can contrast just the congressional climate back then to what we're seeing today when it comes to anybody in Congress willing to impose constraints on what the Trump administration is now doing in places like Nicaragua.
Yeah, the NICA Act was passed actually a few months ago after a years-long lobbying campaign by the Miami lobby and by the Nicaraguan opposition. And it's, I think it's just part of an escalating economic attack. It was passed unanimously. There was no opposition in Congress. This was before the squad was seated in Congress, so we don't know how they would have performed, whether Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would have spoken up. But really, there's just very few people in Congress who say anything about the assault on Nicaragua. The disinformation campaign has become much more successful, and It's carried out by the MRS in many spaces, the Movement for the Renovation of Sandinismo, which plays it, kind of presents itself as, the critical Sandinistas who are the real authentic voices of Sandinismo against the, corrupt dictatorship of Ortega Murillo. But if you actually scratch the surface, as I did, look at WikiLeaks cables, this is a party that's substantially supported by the U.S. government and its regime change arm. They took hundreds of thousands of dollars of electoral support from the International Republican Institute run by John McCain. Their leadership, who, present themselves as these progressive feminists, have actually come to the U.S. to lobby for the NICA Act and met with right-wingers like Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. But they still have managed to win people over, like critics of U.S. empire, like Stephen Kinzer, are very friendly to the MRS. So I think the disinformation campaign is much stronger than it was in the 1980s, when we actually saw congressional Democrats come together and pass the Boland Amendment, specifically to put pressure on Reagan and to limit his ability to wage covert war by forcing the executive to sign off on any covert activity. We don't see any intelligence reform passing through the Democrats. The last thing I remember, the last attempt I remember to reform the covert activities or to limit the covert activities of the military intelligence apparatus was Tulsi Gabbard's Stop Arming Terrorists Act, which she introduced in Congress after returning from Syria. And the whole point of this was to prevent the House Appropriations Committee, which oversees the black budget of the CIA, from allocating more taxpayer money to pay for weapons to groups that are affiliated with or are actually local affiliates of Al-Qaeda, the organization responsible for 9/11. And this should have been greeted by both parties as a breath of fresh air. Finally, we're going to stop arming Al-Qaeda. We're going to stop arming terrorists. Instead, Tulsi Gabbard was demonized across the board. She was attacked on CNN. She was attacked in the Washington Post. Those attacks continue today through the Kamala Harris campaign. And I think she picked up a total of 13 co-sponsors on that bill. I remember going to the press conference and being among maybe 3 or 4 reporters there, one of whom was from, I think the Voice of America, who was criticizing Tulsi Gabbard. So this is the place we're in, where there's very little discussion of sanctions as a lethal act of warfare, and covert activity is something that is either shrugged at by progressive members of Congress or, is something welcomed by both parties. And there should be some attempt, I think, by the Organization of American States to acknowledge one of the greatest lies of the coup last year in Nicaragua, which we reported on at the Grayzone. And I hope everyone, pays close attention to this, because when you try to debate the coup in Nicaragua, people from the opposition or who supported regime change will come at you with statistics that 350 people were killed by Ortega and they were protesters. Maybe 400 people were killed by Ortega. Some will say 500 people were killed, because that's the official number of the human rights arm of the Organization of American States. The reality was that maybe 250 people were killed. Many of them were actually Sandinistas or were police officers. And those who were on the opposition side, many of them were armed and were involved in violence. But there's an even more outrageous story here, which is that the Organization of American States relied for its statistics not on any independent investigation it did, but on a U.S.-funded Nicaraguan quote-unquote human rights group called the Nicaraguan Association for Human Rights, ANPDH in Spanish, which was created in the 1980s by the Reagan administration and the National Endowment for Democracy to report on the human rights abuses of the Sandinistas and to paint the Contras as the victims of this big, evil, Soviet-backed, human rights violation. And recently, completely under the radar of international press, especially of English language, Anglo media, the board of directors of the Nicaraguan Association for Human Rights came out. These are staunch opponents of Ortega, and declared that their director, Alvaro Leyva, had not only stolen $500,000 provided to his human rights group by the US government, in other words, our taxpayer money, just to line his pockets, and that he fabricated and exaggerated death tolls in order to justify that money. This is a giant scandal, and the Organization of American States has had nothing to say about it, nor have all the people in Congress who used these bogus numbers to justify the NICA Act. So here we have the explosion of one of the biggest pieces of the disinformation campaign against Nicaragua, and the silence is completely deafening.
We'll leave it there for now, but come back and talk about Honduras. Max Blumenthal, senior editor of The Grayzone, also author of many books, including The Management of Savagery. Thank you.